Okay, mine is on women and Joseon era and some Goryeo Confucianism. Okay, so the first thing is to compare and contrast the Goryeo dynasty and the Joseon dynasty and how it changed. But so in the Goryeo dynasty, the daughters would inherit along with the sons, and they would get their property. And so when they married, that property was still kept separate from the husbands; it was theirs. And often the husband would come and live with the wives. So like there was a lot of plural wives, so the husband would like travel between different ones. But the thing was that it also made it easier for women to divorce because they weren't dependent on their husbands. They're less negative consequences, and they could be economically stable. They were able to do that. And then the Joseon dynasty, and these weren't like immediate switches. They were like, gradually. But they came to more of a patrilineal system. And so the woman was incorporated into the husband's household. And because of that, they stopped inheriting because the woman's family didn't want to give up that land into the husband's household. So that led to the loss of their inheritance rights, and they became dependent on the husband. And because of that, it was a lot harder for them to have the freedom that they had before. And then with the plural wives, they used to be equal among all of them. And it became that there was a first wife, which is the primary wife, and usually of Yangban status. And their eldest son was the one that would inherit everything. And then the others were secondary wives, and those usually came from commoner or slave background. And their sons would not inherit nearly as much. Okay, so the woman's role was in the domestic area, and the Yangban women, at least, were confined usually to the inner quarters, and they were restricted in who they were allowed to associate with and talk to a lot. It was usually just close kinsmen that they were allowed to. And because they were in such a restricted area, it led to a rise in literature that was aimed at women and teaching them morality. Because they didn't go out and attend schools or anything like that, so they were taught inside their quarters. And a lot of this literature was written by women for women. Who was one that wrote it? I forgot to write it down. But yeah, they wrote a lot in Hangul because that was considered the language that was appropriate for women. Some didn't know Chinese; they could read it, they could write in it, but the most used language was Hangul. And there was a lot of letter writing because they were so restricted. If they wanted to talk to like their family or something, then they would have to write letters, and that left a lot of evidence for today's date to show that women were rather literate in the Yangban. This is talking about the Yangban women elite status. So because women were supposed to be able to write and learn these moral things, education was considered important. It was considered that, empowered them because it prepared them to become, the good mothers and wives and daughter-in-laws that they needed to be. And their view of it was that through this role, even though they're only part of the domestic realm, but because they prepare and they learn and they teach their sons and influence their husbands and their parents-in-laws, that is the way that they're able to help the morality of the public. So if they fail at their job as like a mother, say, then they're going to fail at helping the public world that way. And excessive learning was usually frowned upon. There were some female Confucian scholars, but there weren't a ton whose work survived, at least. And like the male Confucian scholars, I'm pretty sure, usually their work was probably published and gathered after they were dead. And so they have a few of those where like the husband or the brother-in-law usually would gather up their works and publish them either in Korea or in China. Oh, and even though they were Confucian scholars, often these Confucian scholars, what they were praised for was their domestic work. So if they were really good mothers, good daughter-in-laws, and that's what they were praised for. And because of that, they could write good writings in a sense. So they were good because they were good at their domestic role. Okay, so this is one who wrote poems, Honan Soran, that's it. And this is a translation, it came from Colombia. But it's Song on the Swing. It goes, when my female companion and I compete on the swings, hair braided, handcloth on our heads, we are like nymphs. Wind lifts the 5-colored ropes, and we fly up to the skies. These willow branches sing like the tinkling together of pendants. After swinging, we arrange our embroidered slippers again. Returning without a word, we alight on the jade staircase. Then beads of sweat appear on our cicada shakes. Who will retrieve my fallen golden hairpin? And I think this poetess, in particular, a lot of her work was actually published in China. I don't know that it gave a real specific reason. The author kind of implied that it was considered that China wasn't quite as Confucian as Korean, so it's okay for her poems to be published in China. But that's where a lot of them were first written, and they were put into Chinese and not into Hangul when they were published. She was also famous for being the mother of that guy, but she did leave portraits. She's the one on the banknote. Yeah, Professor Peterson was talking about a lot. But yeah, she left several portraits, and a lot of the subject matter was nature and stuff like that, because that was also considered a topic that was appropriate for women. So we've been talking a lot about the Yangban, because that's what's easiest for records. It's female scholars left behind, they were Yangban, and the records we have. But the commoners were affected, and they got a lot of this, the author who wrote this article got a lot of it from looking at the official registers, so where they recorded like who lives in what household, because Korea kept records of stuff like this. But they found that there is a trend of a decreasing number of householders who were female, especially during like the 17th, 18th century. So like they put in the 17th century, women were recorded as either being somebody's wife or as the householders, so they were in charge of the house. But in the 18th century, women were mostly recorded as the mother of so-and-so. And they showed how this emphasized the gender over the age. So it was more important that the son inherit because he was male than that, even if he was, still young at the time, than that the wife be the householder. And the women who were householders, instead of it being viewed as like, a good thing, it was often viewed as, oh, well, they either failed to get married, they didn't give birth to a son that lived, or, something went wrong that somehow they have to be a householder now instead of having a male. And so they showed how this showed that the commoners were coming to accept the patrilineal trend that was common among the Yangban. Before, it was very common for the Yangban to do this, but not necessarily the commoners. And in this area, you can see that this entire way of living is trickling down to commoners. So they would follow this Yangban society, but the commoners really only followed it as far as they were economically capable of doing so. Because, like, an example of this is widows are supposed to, they want to remain chaste, which being chaste is a very important thing in Confucian culture for women, then they can't remarry after they got married once. So, like, a good Confucian woman, after, her husband died, that would be it. She wouldn't get married again. And it was actually considered a beautiful custom for a woman to kill themselves, commit suicide after their husband died, because that was like the ultimate chaste act, supposedly. But the commoner women, like those who didn't have money, just got remarried because they couldn't support themselves. And so, Confucianism was good and well as long as they could economically afford to do so. So then below the commoners, you have the slaves, and they're called the nobis, the entire slave class, and the males were the females would be. But they didn't know that slavery was not a result of Confucianism. Slavery was something already in Korea, and that there were a lot of Confucian scholars that would argue against it, but at the same time they'd be like, oh, well, it's bad, but we need it. Like, we can't. And eventually the slaves were freed through the Joseph dynasty. But the female slave's economic value was in her ability to produce more slaves because the children she had were slaves too, and then also to perform the household work. And this became really important because with the increasing emphasis on having these Confucian rituals and all the preparation that came with it, it required a lot of household work. So that made them really valuable. They became worth more on the market than the male slaves. So it wasn't really often considered a crime for female slaves to be assaulted. People weren't prosecuted for it. Like, it may have been distasteful, but they would still do it. So the one way the bee could defend themselves was to flee to another region and find a master who was stronger or more powerful than their previous master. So the previous master wouldn't want to upset the new one, so he just let her go. And that was male and female slaves fleeing during the 18th and 19th centuries became really common. And so sometimes women and children were sold into slavery to pay off debts or to obtain food. And sometimes just as a means of survival, they did it themselves because they needed food, they needed to live. And in the book I read on women in Confucianism in Joseon, Korea, it tells of a lay who was a former slave who got sold with her children back into slavery by her husband in order to feed her husband's father. And the author goes, for her and her family, lives as commoners have been brief and Confucian obligations to elders unrelenting. So that is what life was like. Were there any questions?
How do you stop this?